Thank you guys so much for coming. Appreciate you taking the time to go through this journey with me. This presentation is very different than it was a year ago. So if you were here a year ago, this is completely new. We've had a lot of very, very significant things happen in the last year. So this will be something that really unveils a journey that has gone back for years now. Back to the beginning of my, I guess you could say, obsession with ancient civilizations. So from an early age, I was the kid on the playground who, instead of playing with everyone else in the swing sets and on the jungle gyms, I was looking for coins and crystals and things, and that's who I am. So, decades later, after studying and spending a lot of my life focused on writing books and understanding our ancient history, but not just our ancient history, our lost history. Something that was once known that became lost. And over time, people didn't think it was real anymore. Historical narratives don't give it any credit. We're being told that our history is a certain amount of years back, and then there's nothing before that except Neolithic primitive hunter-gatherers. And so what I hope to do today is to take you on a journey to see that narrative is old and outdated and needs to change. And for me, all of this work really touches my heart because it changed my life. So I hope it impacts you guys the same way. Now, over the last 2 years, this research has blossomed into not only the new book that I'm writing, but an entire documentary that, if anyone's wondering why it hasn't come out yet, it's because we had to do scouting trips first before we did the filming. And so we will be doing all of the filming from what you're going to see today through the course of this year. And that includes, if anyone has checked into this yet, if it's been to my website, thestageoftime.com, we have the most amount of academics that has ever been part of a project like this in history. We have 2 archaeologists. We have famous geologists like Robert Schoch. We have polymath experts like Robert Edward Grant. We have sacred geometry experts. We have dive experts. We have biblical experts. We have ancient megalithic experts. We bring the top experts that are interested and open-minded, that want to explore these mysteries. And we do that because there are fundamental connections that we see that connect around the world to sites that can't be ignored any longer. Things that are enigmatic and mysterious and strange. Why is this symbol present in Eastern Turkey and nearly the same one is present across the world in Pumapunku, Bolivia? Why? Why is there similar blocks found around Lake Vaughan that are just unbelievably reminiscent of South America? Why is the same step pyramid doorway symbol found across the world in Peru? And there's many, many other places that we're going to be going over as well. Those are just a few as we start this. But again, modern academia and history books are not giving credit for this, what I believe is an entire lost chapter of our history that someday will be illuminated and will change our entire understanding of who we are. And so I wanted to take you on that journey today, and I have a lot of slides to go through. So I apologize if I'm going a little bit quick on some of them. So where this all began for me is that my expertise for over a decade was in ancient Sumer, ancient Mesopotamia. And we're told that the Fertile Crescent is where civilization began, and I do agree with that, but I don't agree on when. I think one of the considerations we have to make is that a lot of people believe that the Sumerians are the only culture that's in ancient Mesopotamia, but there have been Assyrians and Akkadians and Babylonians and others that have come at different time periods. So when did they all exist? And how does this tie into these ancient secrets? because you'll see similarities throughout this presentation that go all the way back to a core beginning, a beginning of knowledge that seemed to originate mysteriously and then spread around the world and create the greatest structures that have ever been created by ancient civilizations. So that's what we're going to be going through today. Now, a lot of people know, at least have obviously heard of and know the story of Noah. Now, the Noah story is often been talked about in the context of the Hebrew Bible and in Genesis as a certain story that paints this individual who brings two of every animal and it goes on a boat and survives. But what a lot of people don't know is that story originated long before the Hebrews and Christians. It originated from a time in ancient Mesopotamia, and the story itself has been told throughout cultures around the world of a great deluge. But where that story is told in the most extensive way are through a number of tablets from ancient Sumer that were found in the 1800s in what's today known as Iraq. The Atra Hasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh tablets extensively talk about an individual named Zayasudra, and is also known as Untapishtim. And this individual seems to be a key to this entire story. And I think that is a really refreshing thing, because we already have this woven into a lot of traditions, that something special occurred during this time that had to do with the reemergence of civilization afterward. And we'll go into that in a second. Now, according to one of the most important tablets called the Sumerian King List, there were 5 original cities created in the Fertile Crescent of the Sumerian region of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. The first city being Eridu, with the last city being Shuruppak. Now, for over 50 to 75 years, Shuruppak was considered to be a myth. It wasn't real. And a lot of scholars and academics would say that all these places were fiction and that they never existed. Well, that changed when some of these places became real. But what I'm pointing out on this tablet that's so important is that the very specific wording that it says here. It says that the last king of Shuruppak, known as Ubaru Tutu, ruled in the city for a certain amount of time before the flood swept over. When you look into Ubaru Tutu, you find that he had a son. The son was known as Zayasudra. Now, this is where the entire mythos from Noah originated from, out of ancient Mesopotamian Sumer. But the story is different than the story that we're told through the biblical context. It describes a very different figure, a figure who was a great sage and a great king, who was warned of a catastrophe and told to protect his family and to survive a great catastrophe, and that he was very important for mankind. That's the story that the tablets describe. And I studied this for over a decade without any leads to anything further, because a lot of the tablets had fractured off, and the story basically ended with this individual, Zayasudra, landing in the mountains of Mount Ararat in eastern Turkey. And that's well known. I'm sure everyone in this room has heard that before. That's nothing new. But what is new is what has emerged from around Lake Von and Mount Ararat in that region over the last 10 to 20 years, in some cases over the last few years. And those sites have taken what was considered aspects that weren't real, for instance, the city that it was from and where they went, and brings us into a whole new light. And we're going to go down this road and show you how all of this connects. So in 1931, Penn University, led an archaeological excavation with both German and American teams to a place called Tel Farah, Iraq. Tel Farah, Iraq is just sort of a primitive set of ruins sitting on top of the desert. But they believed that it was the original location of this mythical city called Shuruppak. Now, why is that so important? Because remember, that entire story is considered by many to be a myth. and not real. And what they were finding and hoping to find was taking myth and turning it into reality. So these are actual photographs from the excavations of Shuruppak in 1931 out in the middle of the desert. This team went out, and this shows massive sandstorms coming through, and they basically describe it as total chaos during these events, trying to dig down to find these ancient ruins. Now, here's a picture of when they reached down 13 feet down after finding evidence of 2 civilizations. 2. So imagine archaeologists are painting this area as having 1 civilization. And what we're finding is that that's not the case at all. In fact, there are 3 civilizations that have been here, showing you that the civilization that was located in this area had built on top of a much older civilization, one that they described as being from a completely different time period of history. And this gives you a reference point where the bottom of this civilization was located. It was 13 to 20 feet down. And they found the ruins of an ancient city, and they found cuneiform tablets that gave us the name Shuruppak. And so much like in the 1800s, when a city of Troy was discovered in western Turkey, we now had something that was once a myth that became a reality. And so this gives you, and these are actual real photographs of the excavation team. And here are some of the artifacts that were found at this level. Now, the most important thing to understand about this is that when archaeologists were digging down to get to this level where they found Shuruppak, what they found was a 5 to 7 foot inundation layer, just entirely flood material on top of an older civilization at the bottom. Now remember, in the story that we had just gone over, the ancient city of Shuruppak was the last of 5 cities created before the flood swept over. And the story describes it as having a massive amount of material basically cover it up and have it disappear from history. And that's exactly what they found. They found what was the evidence that had talked about being underneath a massive alluvial layer, and there they find the remnants of individuals, which the one on the right may actually be Ziusudra. So none of these have been fully determined on who they are, but some experts believe that figure on the right there is Ziusudra. Now, in the tablets, and this is all backstory, everything I'm telling you right now is backstory for where we're about to go. The tablets, again, talk about the Ararat Von region as a place that this boat, this giant craft that is described in the tablets as being built with cedar planks, came to rest. And has anybody heard of the Babylonian map of the world? Has anyone heard of that? Irving Finkel out of the British Museum has done some great videos discussing that, and how in the 90s they actually found a fragment that had been mislabeled. And by putting that together, they were able to determine what all of the map read. And what it described is that this region was where they landed. And I mean, we already knew that, but we have further evidence that keeps emerging that something real occurred here. Some kind of a catastrophe occurred long ago in history, likely predating even the Younger Dryas. That's why I believe, looking at ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica, that what we're talking about is an event that may have actually been a precursor before even the Younger Dryas. Sequences of civilizations rising and falling, with this being the oldest story of all. It literally is the oldest story in humanity. And that's why it's so important to understand what happened to this story. And that is exactly what we're piecing together now. Now, this is the region this is Actomar Island in Lake Vaughan, surrounded by the Taurus Mountains. It's an absolutely beautiful place. It's a place that tourism has yet to discover. People do not go here. When you travel to these places and you visit these sites, you don't see anybody. You don't see any evidence of anything going on at most of them. Some of them are still being excavated, but it's a place that has not been discovered by the outside world yet. And that's going to change. So the first site that fundamentally changed this entire journey for me and really opened up a mystery that I had been exploring for a very long time was a site called Shavuz Tepe. Has anybody heard of Shavuz Tepe yet? Okay, a few people. Okay. Shavuz Tepe is a very mysterious site. And I'm going to go over a couple things about it as we go forward. But the first thing that's very, very interesting about Shavuz Tepe is it's known by the ancient Armenian stories and well documented throughout the Ottoman Empire and the Armenian time period as being called Hakeburg. Hakeburg. Now, King Hake, if you're Armenian, you know him since you've been a young kid because everybody, it's the patron founder of the Armenian culture. His name is King Hake, and he's quite famous. Well, what's really interesting, and I'm actually kind of amazed that this hasn't been further explored, is that King Hake is a direct descendant of Noah. And we know that from a number of places. The first one being the ancient Armenian bloodline descendants, which give us the name Hake right there, right in front of us. It shows that he was a descendant that came all the way down from Noah, Japheth, Gomer, down through the line, and he was a great, great, great descendant of something ancient. And that's known about in ancient Armenia. But what they have not really connected yet, that is emerging now, is the evidence, the archaeological evidence to prove that something happened. Something very special that led to what I believe was a completely forgotten golden age for humanity that started here in this region. So if you were to go to Armenia, you'll see a lot of different paintings and things that depict the connections to Mount Ararat and Noah's Ark and all of these things. So it's not like this isn't known already. But what's not known is when we get into the evidence that proves it. So here again, you have ancient Hebrew maps that show that the sons and descendants of Ziusudra, remember, these are Hebrew names. Japheth being the one that built and did all of this restructuring and creating new regions out of different parts of the world. And now that's something that has been considered a myth by many. Even biblical scholars will say that, how genuine that story actually is and how real it is. Well, let's get into this for a minute because I want to explain how all of this connects to a much greater story. So we are told that Shavuz Tepe was built by a culture called the Urartian or Urartu culture. Now, they were an Iron Age culture that existed around 2800 BC, so about 3,000 years ago. Not that long ago. They're an ancient culture, but they lacked any kind of tools and sophistication beyond Iron Age. And so what we have in front of us is a situation where archaeologists have, in my opinion, greatly misidentified ancient sites with the wrong builders. And because they've been misidentified with the wrong builders, it has led to very little that has been done to connect any of this. And this is why the documentary is being done. And all of these places are being explored. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. Now, as you can see, the basalt work in the center right here is actually some of the finest stone masonry in the ancient world, anywhere in the world. It's on par with anything in Egypt, anything in Peru or Bolivia. It's incredible. Now, notice how it falls down right here a little bit. It's not seamless, and there are other limestone stones underneath it. This shows us evidence that the Urartian culture attempted to rebuild this site. Rebuild it. Not that they created it in the first place, but rebuild it. And this is what has led to a lot of interest with experts because they often agree with me saying something doesn't add up here. Something doesn't make sense. Now, if you go to the Von Museum, they have a wonderful display for the Urartian culture. And this is what they were. They were a war culture that was building with adobe mud brick and crude stones. They were at war with the Assyrian culture to the south. Sennacherib was invading them frequently, and they went to war for hundreds of years. And when that war ended, the Urartian culture mysteriously disappeared and was never seen ever again. In fact, nobody actually knows what happened to them. We just know that they were likely conquered. And then the Assyrian culture may have adopted a lot of their symbols and motifs, but they are not the ones who created those. They also adopted much earlier symbols and motifs from an older culture. So I want to just show you some examples because this is really important. Today we are told, again, that this is all been built by this culture, the Urartians. And it's really important because if it's not, we have an entire mystery for history that is going to change the entire narrative. And that's why this is so important to go over this before we get into some of the more interesting connections and symbols that I want to show you. Now, this just gives you an example of the Urartians. They built with, when they did do megalithic stones, the stonework was very crude. Something that maybe you would see in a place like outside of Greece, in Athens. This is a similar type of stonework maybe in parts of Italy. It's a crude stonework that has no fine polish at all. It's sort of cut in rough grooves and edges and then just put together. Now, the other form of building that they did is what we call adobe mud brick. Now, that's often what we see with the Incan civilization as well, with their building on top of older structures. And we'll get to that as we go. I don't know why that didn't work. Okay, well, for some reason that slide didn't work. But again, I want to point out this, again, one more example of the crude stonework of the Urartians compared to the other culture. I don't know why that slide didn't work. Sorry about that. Okay. And then we're going to get into some good examples. I had a great slide there that showed the difference in the mud brick, but for some reason the image didn't show up. So this is the bread and butter of this entire ancient civilization around Lake Vaughan. The site is called Ayanis. Now, the word Kalesi means fortress, so I don't really like to use that word very often because it has the implications of being a castle. That's essentially what it means. But what we find is a lot of evidence that these were originally had nothing to do with war or castles, and that they were adopted by a war culture, and that was the reason we see the discrepancies. Now, I wanted to show it in the other slide, but it didn't work. But if you look right here, there's a layer of what's called andesite. This whole foundation is built with andesite, and on top of it, you can see this is not dirt. It's actually adobe mud brick that has eroded on top. Now that is what the Urartians were using to build on top of older foundations. Now here's just another viewpoint as an example. When you look at the adobe mud brick on top of this unbelievably hard stone, which is one of the most finely crafted megalithic temples in the world, in my opinion. It's unrivaled with the precision of how they created these symbols without making a single mistake on any of them, seamlessly cutting between massive blocks without having any alterations or divots. Everything is perfect. In fact, as far as I can tell, I have never seen evidence that they ever made a mistake, ever, which is bizarre. Because if you have the finest craftsmen that a culture could ever have, and you have a group of them working on something, how hard would that be to do an entire set of stonework like that and not make a single mistake? That's where it gets bizarre, because it really brings up questions of what are we looking at? You know, what is this culture? The mysteries behind this. And again, I pointed out that at Shavus Tepe, a site right next to Ayanis, we have direct connections to the ancestry of the Noah figures, Ayasudra. So again, going back a bit, it means, what I believe it means, is that this group landed in this region, and through some kind of celestial influence, because we see Haldi, the god Haldi, all over the place. And we'll go into that more as we get along. But we see some kind of an infusion of knowledge, potentially unlike anything we've ever seen. Infusion of knowledge, but not just any knowledge, divine knowledge. Divine knowledge of the heavens, the cosmos, earth, the balance and harmony that exists with all things. If you were to lower a certain kind of knowledge in a hierarchy, this would be considered the highest level knowledge that you could possibly lower. And we're going to get into what that knowledge is in a second. So here's another great example to show the two different sides. Here you see the andesite foundations right here, and then you see the mud brick built right on top. Now we have evidence to strongly suggest, I was here with Robert Schock this past year, and we were analyzing and talking to them about when the site was found and what it looked like. And they believe that the Urartians may have buried this site, buried it, under enormous amounts of sediment to preserve it. Now, you can imagine a culture that inherited something very sacred, something very important. And they were in the middle of war, in the middle of being invaded by other cultures to the south. You could imagine that they may want to protect it for another time in the future. Because if this site was not buried, it likely would not be here today. It would have been destroyed and removed, and we would have none of this evidence left. But they buried it for a time long in the future. It remained buried for 3,000 years. Think about that for a minute. For 3,000 years, cultures rose and fall throughout the area, including the Armenians, who never knew that this site existed. And in the late 1980s, archaeologists started working at the bottom parts of this site, and by the time the early 2000s, around 2001 to 2003, they reached the inner, what's called the Haldi temple here. And that discovery came with a lot of unknowns. They called this the mystery room. That's what archaeologists called this. No doors, no windows. The mystery room. They had no idea what its purpose was. They had no idea how it was created. But we know that it was not done by the Urartian culture. Now, this is what it shows behind what is an altar in the back. And you can see some very important symbols that I believe connect back to all around the world, but not just ancient cultures. We're talking about secret societies and powerful religions as well. And as we go further in this, we'll see some of those connections and how fundamentally important they are. Now, right here on the side, I want to show you see the symbol of the sun. Well, we know this was a solar temple. We know it had something to do with likely tracking the movements of the sun across the sky. And my theory and belief is that because the temple faced directly west, is that when the sun was setting in the west, the sun would come into the inner chamber and land right above the altar. But we don't have enough information yet to fully know that or what the function of the site was. But as we go along, I want you to see how important a lot of these symbols and a lot of these things become. Because I believe a lot of this has to do with certain symbols representing guardians of something important. You see on the top left and the top right, this figure right here. There's a griffin and a dragon on either side. And we know that in ancient cultures, the dragon and the griffin have been guardians. Guardians of what, though? That's what we're going to get into. Now, the next site that's right across the lake, and again, these are all in the Lake Vaughan region. The next site that is absolutely bizarre and mysterious is called Kef Kalesi. Now, when I've showed this image to people who are familiar with megaliths around the world, the first thing they say is that Bolivia? And I say, no, it's actually Lake Vaughan in Turkey. And they're mystified because not only have people not heard about this at all, but the level of precision and what they were building is highly mysterious even today. and we're going to go into some of what was found here. This place is very special. If you can imagine having to hike up an entire mountain to a temple site that overlooked Lake Vaughan, it is one of the most sacred places that I've ever been in my life. Very, very special, sacred place. And you can feel that when you go here. I've had the privilege to go here twice. And it's something that every time I go, I find new things. And it's a place that has been less than 5% excavated. And we know that because we walk around the site and we find ancient walls and megalithic stones sticking out of the ground all over the place. It's quite an enormous site, actually. So here, again, I don't know why some of these didn't work, but here is a picture of Robert Schock analyzing a massive altar-like stone, a bas-relief that has what he has determined is vitrification on it. So for those who don't know what vitrification is the melting of stone from extremely, extremely hot temperatures. Now, not temperatures that we think about on today with, 100 degrees, 150 degrees, but they've determined that in order to melt these types of stones, you would have to have temperatures that exceed 2,000 degrees. And that's what gets into the mystery of all this, because this civilization that built all of these just mysteriously disappeared in history. They left no writings of any kind. The only language that we can determine that they communicated through was symbolism. Symbols. That was their means of leaving behind very, very important messages. Now, I want to point this slide out because this is a type of pillar design that surrounds these temples, and this is at Kef Kalesi, and here at Ayanis, you can see the same pillar design. So we know that these sites were closely associated, and I believe that Kef Kalesi had an opening that faced the west just like Ayanis did. And so, again, as we're getting into this, we're finding a lot of similarities between these. Now, if anybody's followed my work, they know I talk about this all the time. I believe that this is, bar none, one of the most important artifacts in history. This artifact, which is actually part of at least 10 bas-reliefs. And when I was last here, I had a chance to go down to a storage room, and I was able to be shown 7 others, but they were heavily damaged. Now, this one is being held in Ankara right now. It's the only one that was in the condition that it's in now. The other 7 were heavily ruined, damaged, but it shows us that there were at least 10 of these, and they're massive. They're roughly 4 feet by 4 feet. They're quite large. Solid basalt. And what they show us are some of the cores of Hermeticism, some of the cores of ancient concepts like in the Kabbalion and others relating to the importance of balance and the tree of life and the passing of the pine cone, but not the bucket or handbag, a chalice, like the Holy Grail. A chalice, which if you look up what a chalice means, it means the passing of an important spiritual or religious doctrine, okay? But not just something that is related to monotheistic religions, something related to the origins of the tree of life and these 3 doorways. These 3 doorways that have 3 levels on each end. And I want everyone to look very, very closely at these and remember them because you're going to see them all over the world. All over the world. But this is where they all began. Now, what's really interesting is the first thing I can point out so everyone understands is that these individuals are not actually the same. They're slightly different, and I can go into that here. Now, has anyone heard of the Trimurti? The Trimurti is the ancient connection of celestial creator forces that are in ancient India. The Trimurti represents the balance between Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Now, to understand what those mean, it means that Brahma, being the creator of all things, like nature, would be representative of what I consider to be like God. Now, you have two other forces next to Brahma. So Brahma would be the tree of life. And again, I'm showing you the parallels with what I believe is literally the same knowledge passed to India. What you can see here is that this god right here, instead of being Haldi, is known as Toshiba. He is a god of storms and destruction. Now, on the right side, you have Haldi, who is considered to be the god of knowledge and preservation of life, just like we see with the equivalent of Shiva and Vishnu. So automatically, one of the most core principles we see in ancient India, we find what may be the origins of that entire set of knowledge and teachings here on this. Now, this leads us into some really exciting discoveries and connections around the world. And again, I have so many slides that I have to go a little bit quicker on some of these than I would like. Now, this is what I believe will be the smoking gun piece of evidence that finally helps us to rewrite the historical narrative as we know it. Because underneath Lake Van contains megalithic ruins of high precision that are located at such a depth that it would be impossible to explain it during the time period that the Urartians existed. These ruins that you're seeing in front of you are found at 75 feet underwater. 75 feet down. Unbelievable depth. And if anybody ends up, hopefully you all end up watching the documentary when it comes out. But that individual right there in the back is named Tosin Seylan. He is an underwater diver and photographer from Turkey who dives in mostly oceans around the world with marine fish and different things. He's not an archaeologist. And he accidentally stumbled upon these ruins in 2017. They did not know they existed. That would make this one of the newest archaeological sites in the world. But it's not really an archaeological site because they're not excavating it. It's just a site. Now, what is contained in these ruins will probably blow your mind because it keeps opening up connections to other places around the world. And as we get along, I want to point out that individual, Tosin Seylan, who discovered these ruins, is part of the team. He is part of our team that is going to be leading us to dive down and film these underwater ruins this year. So check this out. On one of the capstones on the top of this underwater structure, you see the six-spoked flower of life, one of the most fundamentally important symbols in ancient cultures around the world. But is that the only one? It's not. Here's the Kef bas-relief again. Notice, hidden right in plain sight, the flower of life is right there. Now also, if we were to look closely at the Ayanis altar, right down the bottom, there it is again. The flower of life symbol connected all around the Lake Van region. And again, as we go along, you're going to see how all of these symbols then connect to teachings and knowledge around the world. Now, why is the flower of life so important? The flower of life represents the sacred geometry of creation, like the blueprint of God, of Source. And they believed that they were basically lowering the knowledge of all things, of all creation and all balance. And the fundamental principles that are echoed here can change humanity's entire understanding of our roles here, who we are, our roles, and what we were long ago. Great stewards and great sages and great mystics of this world who understood the mysteries of reality and understood that the third-dimensional physical reality is a great illusion. And that what really exists beyond that is an entire energetic world that connects back to the very fundamental aspects of creation itself. So take a look at this. Here we are in Egypt. Okay, we're in the Osirian in Egypt, which is a subterranean megalithic area with gigantic granite columns of stone that came from over 450 miles away from the Aswan Quarry. And again, just like we see at Lake Vaughan, here you have the crude dynastic Egyptian stonework above it with these gigantic megaliths below, clearly not created by the same civilization. Now, on the side of these blocks, you see the six-spoked flower of life, exactly the same shape, the same amount of spokes, all the way across the world. That's not a coincidence. There are no coincidences. What I believe we're looking at is evidence of an entire lost global civilization that was destroyed during the Younger Dryas catastrophes 11,600 years ago, and all memory of them and the legacy that they once were was forgotten. And over thousands and thousands of years, primitive warlike cultures emerged and found these sacred places and usually built on top of them. But they had no idea the knowledge and the abilities that that culture had. No, so what we're going to be doing now is we're going to be traveling around the world to other connections that you're going to see that I think are going to be undeniable. And so the first one is, here is Lake Vaughan and here is Lake Titicaca. I believe upon studying both of these sites that they may have been like a sister civilization, something mirroring itself. Lake Titicaca has a lot of similarities with Lake Vaughan. They both are surrounded by large volcanic peaks, and they're both extremely deep. Extremely deep was an important concept for ancient legends of Viracocha and other celestial connections down into the inner earth of something from long ago. And for some reason that we don't fully understand yet, that these large, deep, ancient lakes played some kind of a sacred purpose for these cultures. We've just begun to uncover that yet. Why focus on these places? All we can think of is that some kind of a sacred energetic reason, but we don't know. Now, I want to show this slide for a second because I want to show the similarities with the god Viracocha from South America and the god Haldi from Lake Vaughan. Now notice, they're obviously not the same, but they're similar. See how Haldi is surrounded by pillars on each side? Pillars on each end, just like Viracocha is holding two pillar-like condors, like for balance on either end. And as I've come to study these, I believe that Viracocha is Haldi. And if anyone wants to know who that is going way back to the very beginning, I believe that he was the Sumerian god Enki, the god of creation and preservation of life. That's what his name is, just like we see Vishnu. They're the creator gods, the knowledge bringers. And I believe they traveled around the world to connect these. Now take a look at this. Here we are across the world at Ollantaytambo in Peru. And here we have, take a look at this, the window with the 3-level steps. And right in the courtyard of Ollantaytambo is a damaged block that still has one side remaining, the same 3 levels with the same door in the center. How is that possible? All the way across the world. It's not like it's a design that's so simple that you would just accidentally create the same one. It's something far different. Far different. This idea of a reality that is in complete balance and in harmony. And these 3 doors representing the different aspects of creation and balance in the entire universe and on Earth. And I think that these places were absolutely linked. So take a look at this. Here we have the most famous symbol of all in South America called the Chicana design. Now, if you take a look at the Chicana, this piece right here represents the barrier between as above, so below, the law of correspondence concept. So if you were to go back to this and look, you can see that the inverted pyramid and the pyramid that's not inverted, what would happen if you stacked them on top of each other? You would get that symbol. It's the same symbol. And I believe that the Chicana symbol originated from the Ararat Vaughan region. And it was a very fundamentally important symbol representing the balance above and below. And we'll get into that in a second. So here's the Chicana right here. The Incan step cross pyramid representing different levels of existence. So they already mentioned that, right? Different levels of existence, and take a look at this. That's the cross from Ayanis. We find the same similarities coming from the most important crosses of history. And we happen to have both of them in each location based on each other. Okay. Hold on. Okay. So here's another example. I love this example. I got a chance to visit this past year. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. This is known as the Spring of the Nusta. And the Nusta meant an Incan priestess. And you see that not only do you have the 3 levels of the step pyramid just like we have there, but you have the 3 levels inside as well. So it's essentially the same core concept teaching that has a spring flowing right through the top of it. So if we're talking about symbols that represent balance and harmony, and you were to create this on a spring, it would make sense that that's what they were trying to achieve, is creating a very, very special ancient civilization that inherited the knowledge of divinity of everything. Let's keep going for a minute. Here is the Coricancha in Cusco, Peru. Now, I was here with Robert Edward Grant, and I did not know about this before. And I just came across this, and I couldn't believe it. But in the Coricancha is this very strange-looking stone. It's rather large, and it has 4 elongated square edges that protrude out the sides. When I saw this, I immediately remembered those pillars that I showed you from Kef Kalesi and Ayanis. If you look down here, it's the same design. Over and over again, the same concepts are found across the world. Now, there's one more that's even more important, or as important. Now, this is called the T-pillar. Now, here on the right side, you can see me next to a massive basalt T-pillar. Now, look, you can see the 3 levels in the center with the T at the top. Now, that's really important to remember, because as we get into other Bolivian sites, I want to show you that symbol and how that is used all throughout, okay? Now, getting back to the Kef bas-relief, again, look, there's the same symbol over and over again, 3, the god Haldi passing it with 3 with 2 behind. It's the same symbol, and there you are at Chavus Tepe, the bloodline descendant of the Noah figure, and we have the same symbol built out of multi-ton. I've been told by Robert Schock this would be between 3 and 7 tons each. These are massive. I have counted at least 7 of these on the grounds. Now, this symbol is exactly the same as the one, the Kef bas-relief, but that's not the only place we find it. Take a look at this. Here's another picture of that T-pillar at Chavus Tepe, and take a look at Pumupunku. Now, what's interesting about the one at Pumupunku is the only difference in this is that it has these 3 levels on the outside that slightly differ from this. Now, the way that I interpret this is that it seemed as though this mirroring sister civilization had similar knowledge, very similar teachings and knowledge being passed down, but they decided to show things in a slightly different way, slightly different. And that is shown here, but is it that much different? This is basically like the step pyramid within the T-pillar. It's like the 2 concepts are woven into one single symbol. And I think that was the purpose behind it. But things like this can't be ignored. It's like we're looking at the breadcrumbs of a forgotten time in history, that we once had all of these locations connected. And of course, everybody knows the famous site of Göbekli Tepe are also T-pillars. But is that the only one? Take a look at this. Menorca, Spain, 60-ton, 16-foot-tall pillars from the same situation of a culture that lived there that built crude stonework all around it. To me, it's impossible that the culture that built with like this decided to build this. It makes no sense at all. There's something going on here with history that needs to be corrected. And again, there's those T's again, just like we see all throughout the Vaughan region. Now, on the backside, and this is actually usually missed because a lot of people are very familiar with the front side of the Gate of the Sun, but not the backside. The backside, to me, is the more interesting aspect because here you have those T-pillar doorways again, just like that symbol we saw with the central door. Remember, there was 3 doors on the Kef bas-relief, 3 doors. And so here we have the 3 doors with the one in the center, Brahma, like God, of source of creation in the very center, just like we see the tree of life on the Kef bas-relief. I think that you're talking about the same thing, the different doorways of reality. And it gets even better than that. Remember this? That's the sun cross symbol. Now, as we go along, we see connections throughout history from this. Despite the fact that in the ancient Inca, we see indigenous groups still maintain the Chicana, but it doesn't exist elsewhere beyond indigenous groups. Whereas the sun cross, we see throughout history. And it becomes a very, very important cross that is only superseded by eventually when you get to the classic Christian cross, which changes the meaning and some of the definitions behind what they originally represented. So take a look at that. Now, I want to point out here that the stone that this is built out of is one of the hardest stones on earth. It's known as andesite. It's a volcanic stone that is roughly 7.5 on the Mohs hardness scale out of 10. It's one of the hardest stones on the earth. And they were able to seamlessly cut these symbols through the middle of these stones. How they did that is completely a mystery today. I do not believe that these sites were cut with hand tools. Whether or not it was some kind of a heated plasma type of altering or some kind of a machining with like diamond tips, we don't know. But the conventional narrative on Iron Age tools creating this is completely false in my opinion. Now, the reason why archaeologists believe that these sites were created by the Urartian culture is because there's cuneiform writing found in the walls of many of the temples and many of the locations, just like Shavuos Tepe has its own cuneiform writing. Now, the language of that is Urartian. Now, that is the basis, the only reason why archaeologists believe the Urartians created this was because of that. That's it. There's no other reason why they believe that the Urartians created this. Now, the problem is, when you go to Egypt, you learn that Egypt, the original dynastic Egyptians, left no writings at all. All hieroglyphics from the Egyptians came from the later time periods of the dynastic Egyptians. Meaning that if you had originally come to Egypt before, thousands of years ago, before the dynastic Egyptians, you would have not seen one single writing there at all. So what we have is a situation where, just like we see with the Great Sphinx being recarved to have a pharaoh's head, we saw manipulation of these sites by another culture who tried to take credit for their creation. That's a very important point to make. To take credit for their creation, for their grandeur, which is very disrespectful at the same time. And it's strange to me how you can incorporate and appreciate within their culture with artwork a lot of the symbols that were predated them, at the same time steal their sites and potentially pretend that you were the ones who created them. Now, I'm not trying to put down the Urartians. I think that they were a very important ancient culture. I'm simply pointing out that the evidence is very extensive that they are not the ones who built these sites. And that the culture that built these sites, I believe, is linked all around the world to an origin point that started here. So take a look at this. If you travel to Pumapunku in Bolivia, you'll see that they also have the cross there. Now, it's not quite the same as the sun cross, but it's a very similar cross in the same sense. And as I pointed out before, it seems as though a lot of symbols were taken and slightly altered for the purposes of how that culture wanted to portray it. And as many of you have probably seen along your journeys in this life, the seal of the Templars is the exact same sun cross that we just saw at Ayanis. And there's no way that that's a coincidence. This cross was fought over for thousands of years during the Byzantine period and later, with different groups wanting to take ownership of it. And eventually the Knights Templar were hunted down and exterminated. And this cross only existed in certain upper echelons of religious groups and secret societies. And you may know some of those today. A lot of people may not realize that it's not the Christian cross that the Vatican uses, but in fact, the exact same cross still from Ayanis. Now, we don't find any other sites anywhere in the world that have the sun cross in them. None. Ayanis is the only one that we've ever seen in history that focused everything around this one cross. This one cross representing what I believe is the balance and totality of all, basically through sun being God, and that it represents the balance of all things. And so today, again, you see that it's everywhere. It's on the staff, it's on their cloak, it's all over their clothing. What do ancient religions know about this? Is that why when these sites were found in 1964, many of them were dismantled, hidden? We are now just beginning to understand how much may have been lost from the Lake Von region over the course of the last 50 plus years. Because when they were first found, there was very little interest in them being known by the world. In fact, today, most people don't even know that they exist. What are they trying to hide from these ancient sites that relates all the way back to religions and ancient civilizations in the very beginning of everything? And that is exactly what we are exploring. We're trying to get to the heart and the bottom of these mysteries that connect around the world to what I believe was the entire lost civilization golden age of our history. You may even be able to call them Atlanteans. We don't even know what they were called. They didn't leave a name behind. We just know they were a highly advanced ancient civilization that seemed to be all over the world. We know that we have evidence in Peru. We have evidence in Bolivia. We have evidence at Mitla in Mexico. We have evidence in places like obviously Turkey. We have evidence in Egypt. We have evidence in Baalbek, Lebanon, all over the world, China, Japan, of a mysterious civilization that built giant stones that are highly polished and left behind sacred symbols and then mysteriously disappeared in history, taking no ownership over what they built, leaving no ability for us to determine exactly who they were, like just breadcrumb trails of a shadow that had enlightened and brought divinity to humanity before they forgot all of it. And I think the reason why we forgot a lot of it is a lot of it has been hidden. I do believe that. So the real question on the table now that we have to ask is it time to completely rewrite the story of history? What would that do to humanity? How would they view themselves if we found out we didn't just come from nomadic hunter-gatherers and emerged during the Iron Age? What if we found out we had an entire chapter where we had mastered esoteric and mysticism and understood the balance of the cosmos and the heavens and all of creation? Imagine how people's identity would change if they knew that we had once built the greatest structures ever created and then mysteriously vanished. What kinds of questions would open up about the functionality of these sites, why they were created, how they were created, and most importantly, the knowledge that they were leaving behind for future generations to understand about the very beginning. And I want to point out that this stone right here that I'm sitting next to, the reason I use this as an example, this is at Ayanis, actually. And it is an area that is off limits to the public where you have to get permission to go into. And they believe there's I believe there's another entire Susi temple, they call them Susi temples, that is in the back of the original one, meaning they came in pairs. They were two. Now, does that mean that one faced west and one faced east? That's what I believe. But a lot of this work is just in its infancy. And that's why I believe having experts like we have joining forces to explore this, we can really get to the heart of this mystery. I believe it's a mystery that will greatly enhance humanity and perhaps create an entire movement of thinking about our past and who we are. And so, anyway, I want to say that this is what keeps me up at night and excites me. Every time I visit these sites, I learn something new, and it's always a powerful experience that moves me. Like there's a memory of an ancient energy of sacred knowledge that still remains in these sites. And you can feel it when you go to them. And so if you want to join me at these sacred sites, I will be hosting my first tour this September, and you will get to visit Ayanis and Shavuz Tepe and Kef Kalesi and be able to go and help make history. Places that you can walk around and actually discover history. Megalithic blocks and other artifacts that have never been excavated that we can find together. To me, this is what will change our entire understanding of history in the future. And we're just at the beginning of exploring that now. Well, thank you guys. And I'm going to take some questions. Join me September of 2025 for a tour of the Lake Van area of Turkey to explore its ancient megalithic ruins. You can sign up on my website at thestageoftime.com. We'll see you there.